Baruch Hashem, you're a bad Jew.
Shalom.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Bad Jew, the place where there is no such thing as a bad Jew. With me today is Rabbi Dubov, who I had the pleasure of taking classes with at the Aisha Torah Yeshiva over there in Israel. And here's how this episode happened, guys. There was like this incredible course. He had this multi-part course that was taking place over days. And I was so excited to get to the free will portion of the talk. And then I had to go home. And it was like such bad timing in terms of me coming home, not just because it was the day before Tisha B'Av to fly home, but it was also I had to miss this amazing class. So I finally get to have this class and I get to share it with you. Free will is one of those concepts that I've always been super fascinated with, and I finally get to hear it. This is also a concept that has been asked on this podcast by the Bad Jew WhatsApp community. That's a WhatsApp community of fans of this show that have the safe place to ask these questions, to be able to explore different ideas and concepts, and also to share personal things that are happening in their Jewish journey with a supportive community. So, being said, Rabbi Dubov, it's great to have you here on the podcast. There's a rite of entry onto this show, which is the 4-minute Bad Jew challenge, telling your life story in 4 minutes. Are you ready?
I guess so, Chaz. Excellent to be here with you. Let's see if we can do it. I want to correct you, I think, in two ways. Number one, this might be trite, but you were home when you were in Israel, our ancestral homeland. That's number one. You went back to Los Angeles, which is a wonderful place to be. And number two, I'm really honored to take on this topic and quench the thirst of all of your WhatsApp group and you as well. It's the most exciting part for me is being here live with you.
That really is so sweet. Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. Israel is home, and Los Angeles it's just a pleasant detour. Being said, we're going to start the 4-minute Bad Jew challenge. Echad, Shtayim, Shalosh, Yalla.
So what's up, everybody? My name is Mikhail Zalman Dubov, and that's a mouthful, so I just go by MZ. Where do I begin? Let's start at birth. I was born in a place called Minsk, Belarus, under the former Soviet Union rule, communist Russia, going way back, okay, to 1989. And there I was, born to a family of very good-hearted people with special values, but not anything particularly Jewish to speak of in terms of our education, our upbringing. By no fault of their own, for many generations already, the communist regime had wiped out and I would say spiritually annihilated, unfortunately, many more Jews than Hitler, Yimach Shmo, did physically. And so we were very assimilated. My father was an engineer and part of the government. And slowly but surely, as the whole thing was coming to an end, they saw the writing on the wall, as the expression goes. And they saw that Russia was not going to be the place for them to have a successful future in any way, shape, or form. There was also a tinge of anti-Semitism, which is ironic and kind of funny. Not that anti-Semitism is funny, but we weren't outwardly Jewish at all, except for, I guess, the Shnaz and the Jufro when I grow it out. You know what I'm saying? But outwardly, we were just Russians. But on every single piece of identification there, it said nationality, Yevrei, Ivri, Hebrew, Jewish, right? So we fled. That's actually quite a dramatic story, how we fled in the middle of the night, crossing the border. It was illegal to leave at that time. And eventually, with the help of HIASC and the Jewish Agency, we made it into sweet New York City. Okay, I think we fly into JFK. And eventually, we were naturalized as U.S. citizens. And I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, a good Jewish boy. It's funny, like we almost made it finally when we went to New York, because back there we were, the Jews, even though outwardly not Jewish at all. And here in New York City, we were Jewish and we were proud of it. And we were finally able to, quote unquote, practice freely. But yet nobody knew that we were Jewish. We were just the Russians now. We were part of like the Russian immigrant community in Brooklyn, Brighton Beach, Coney Island, if anyone is familiar with that. And so I grew up in public school my whole life. I really only spoke Russian until I was about 7 years old. I was very, motivated to get a good education, to have a great, solid, stable career, maybe eventually get married, have a family continuity of our species and all of that. And that's really the way I spoke and thought too, is I was a self-proclaimed atheist. I never really gave Judaism or spirituality that much of a chance. Let's put it like that. What could I say? My family was not part of any kind of synagogue, not even Reform, not conservative, no affiliation whatsoever. Standing online to sit on Santa's lap back in the day, if that's a thing that even happens anymore. You had the Kwanzaa Kia on one side and you had the menorah on the other side. I said, Mom, I got the Hanukkah. We missed the first night. Let's make it up. So we came home, we plugged it in, we dusted it off, plugged it in, and spun the little blue bulb there, played some dreidel, ate some latkes. my level of observance was essentially zero. My level of knowledge was zero. I actually grew up, funny enough, in a very Jewish Orthodox neighborhood, and we had no idea about the everyday Jewish things that we were seeing. Every Saturday morning, I would see women all done up with their hair did. It was actually a wig, but I didn't know that, which might be problematic, but that's another conversation you might want to have with your listeners at another time. They looked like in their full, evening attire. And I said, Mom, there's a wedding every single Saturday and it's this early in the morning, what's going on? And she didn't really know that it was Shabbat and had to describe that to me. So really grew up without the basics. And it wasn't until actually I went to a place called Boston College, which is a Jesuit Catholic university for all of your listeners who don't know. Great athletics program. Matt Ryan was our starting quarterback freshman year. And we had essentially a very good business school. And that's why I went there. And slowly but surely, I felt very much out of place. I felt very Jewish all of a sudden for the first time in my life, with all the crosses on the wall and people leaving parties early on Saturday night to make it to mass the next morning. And I gravitated naturally towards my Jewish, students, my classmates, and upper class Israelis for the most part, who made Yerida, who moved to the States or were playing sports internationally or just getting their education internationally. And a lot of my friends were Israelis who encouraged me to go on Birthright, a Taglit trip to Israel. And after doing that in 2000, that's when the first Gaza war happened, really. It's Operation Cast led. And that was a really paradigm shifting experience for me. When I came back to the United States of America, I came back to a different campus, a campus full of anti-Zionism, what I perceived as anti-Semitism as well at the time. There was all kinds of lies, essentially what I found to be lies, spreading around campus, around Boston, the greater Boston area, about my people, about my country. And I felt it was my country, even though I'd only been there for about 10 days. A bit of pride, introduction to the other side of things for myself as a liberal Jew at that time also showed me that Israel is a complicated place in a complicated part of the world. And it really is a beacon of democracy and hope for a fundamentalist, region here. And essentially, I decided to stand up for truth. My friends and I started an organization called Eagles for Israel, which I'm very proud to say still exists to this very day, doing all kinds of Israeli cultural events and diplomatic events on campus. And that led to me meeting Jews from the greater Boston area, including Rabbi Hanan Wiener, who deserves a shout out, certainly. Rabbi Wiener was a student of Rabbi Noach Weinberg of blessed memory, who was the founder of Aish internationally, Aish.com, Aish in Jerusalem, all of the different Aish branches around the world. And Rabbi Wiener started partnering with us, sponsoring kosher food at our events, having us over for our first Shabbat meals ever for many of us. And it was through understanding him and his home and just his lifestyle, at least a little bit of it that he shared with us. I saw a man who lived his values, who was very kind and caring, loved all of humanity, especially Jewish people, his brothers and sisters. And he called me out on my ignorance. And he said to me at the end of my stint there at Boston College, he said, "You're not an atheist. You're just an idiot. You don't know anything. You haven't learned anything. How can you possibly say there's no God? Have you ever done the research from cosmology, physics, biology, philosophy, neuroscience? Have you ever looked at the evidence? Come on." And you think Jewish history only goes back to the Holocaust? Like, no wonder, it's pretty whack to be a Jew. You either won or you lost the genetic lottery in your mind, right? So go to Israel, he offered me after my university time. And he said, learn about what it really means to be Jewish, then come back here and do whatever you were going to do. Just do it a little bit more Jewish. And at the time, that was a big move for me because I was essentially engaged to a wonderful woman who happened to not be Jewish. And my career choices at the time were going to be anything but that of a good Jewish boy. I was definitely a bad Jew by all accounts, my hobbies, my party lifestyle, my ignorance. And so I went to Israel. And like many Jews, once you are actually faced with people who live the ancient tradition in a meaningful and relevant and powerful way, and your misconceptions start going out the window, and you actually open your mind and kind of put your ego in your back pocket and start listening rather than imposing. I was actually shocked to find how much Jews are interested in truth. They're so willing to be convinced by a side that is other than the one that they themselves espouse. And I said to myself, if I could spend 4 years learning how to maximize profits and minimize costs and ironically put myself into debt doing so, then maybe I could spend 4 months learning in yeshiva so I can prove these rabbis wrong, maybe from their own texts, hopefully, please God, so to speak. And so I went home after that summer. My boss gave me until January to begin. And so I had 4 months, the entire fall and part of the winter, to start my Jewish education. I'm sure I failed your challenge by the look on your face. Yes, you got the rabbi. It's okay. Thank you for being so respectful and not interrupting. But that's really sweet. I don't even know how long it's been. But the point is that those 4 months showed me what I don't know. And I was really humbled by the vast sea of knowledge that Judaism has to offer. And so I decided to double down, and 4 months became 8 months. And after that, I realized, people take gap years, people, they volunteer around the world. And I decided to volunteer in Israel to become educated. And that's what I did. And slowly but surely, it was very clear to me that education was my passion. And I was blessed after a couple of years in yeshiva to meet a young woman who supported me in that endeavor. And today, thank God, we live here in Jerusalem. I'm an educator at Aish on all the different programs at Aish. And she actually, funny enough, went from the for-profit sector to nonprofit. And she is the managing director of all of the Aish women's programming here in Jerusalem and around the world. And yeah, we're here in French Hill with our kids and our life here. And any of your listeners who would like are free to shout us out when you're in Jerusalem and come for a Shabbat meal.
That's amazing. So yeah, you definitely did not squeeze that into a 4-minute Bad Jew challenge, but for the 11 minutes that was, I will say that
no, that was not 11 minutes, and you did not have your timer on your shoulder as promised, my friend.
What do you mean? It was right here the whole time.
Oh, but I can't see it in this format over here.
I took it down after the 4 minutes, bro.
No, I didn't even see it at the start. I'm be perfectly honest.
That's okay. Listen, it was 11 captivating minutes because you're a great speaker and you have a great story. First of all, here's the thing. When you're at the yeshiva, you just go right into your story. You just go right into the lesson of the class. We don't I could bet, I'm willing to bet my entire savings account that the average yeshiva student would not know that entire story. And I think that's really cool. And I really hope that the students here at Aish Torah do get to hear that story, because I actually didn't know any of that about you. And I really want to see a picture of your Afro days. That's great. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I also want to share that I really admire your Jewish journey and the sacrifice that you made to be where you are today. I think it's really cool what you're doing, and I have a lot of admiration for it. So one thing I want to ask actually before I even get to the main question of the episode is what specifically about the concept of free will are you passionate about? Why are you passionate about that personally?
Yeah, good question. So it dawned on me actually through conversations with our current Rosh Hashiva, our dean, so to speak, of our higher educational, institution here in Jerusalem, Rabbi Berkowitz, that it dawned on me that free will is something that bothers a lot of people. Personally, it didn't bother me. I guess I wasn't all that deep of a thinker. I know it bothered you, and you had shared that with me, but it didn't bother me all that much. And what I realized is that the implications of not having free will, as so many out there unfortunately do at least claim to subscribe to that philosophy, the implications of that are essentially, what I realized is that they don't exist. There is no them to speak of, and we can get into that in depth throughout our conversation, but that's the scariest thing in the world. So when I teach about free will, really in my own mind, what I'm doing is I'm giving people the gift of their own reality, of their own agency back to them. And if they already believed in free will, then I'm helping them clarify exactly what it means that they have free will, and what I believe in their ancestral tribal tradition teaches them they should be doing with their free will, essentially.
Fascinating.
But it's their choice.
Yeah, definitely. So let's get into it then. I'm going to ask the question that this episode titled after, like I always do. Here it is. Is there free will? And if so, how?
There's no way in the world that I can possibly demonstrate to you that you have free will. That I will put right on the table to begin with. Okay. That's number one. And at least not in any classical way. I don't want to be anti-intellectual. I don't want to be dogmatic. I want to be honest. And I want to, first of all, say that I do believe we have free will. And how, essentially, to cut to the chase, is only if our spiritual tradition, and not only our spiritual tradition, but that of many people around this world, if there is a metaphysical, higher level consciousness, call it a soul, call it a neshama, call it whatever you'll call it in any other language, if that exists, and if there is a creator, an infinite creator and sustainer of the universe, that allows for us to exercise our divine will, then yes, we have free will. But if either of those things are not true, which again would be impossible to demonstrate in any serious way through this medium, then no, there's absolutely no way that we have free will. And to even think that you have free will is laughable. And my path towards truly understanding, to the extent that I do now, why it is that I believe we have free will and what the nature of that free will is first by examining the case against free will. Because I used to espouse it myself, if you would have pressed me hard to actually think that deeply, and for sure, I mean, free will, it's a sci-fi concept. I don't think it exists in this world.
Definitely. And I'll tell you right now that, like, I think there was a time in college where, whether it was the influence of people that I surrounded myself with or just conclusions that I realized on my own, in that time, I used to not believe in free will. I mean, here are some of the primary arguments of what supports there not being free will, right? The first one is I didn't choose to be born. Second one is second thing is that all my actions are a cause and effect by everything in and around me. For example, if it's cold, I'm going to wear a jacket. I can't choose to fly somewhere that's warmer because I don't have the wings. Thus, I'm limited by my body. So there's the third point as well. Your physical form is limiting, and thus you cannot freely just choose to do whatever you want, right? And
well, you know, it's funny. I would quote some of those that are you would consider my intellectual opponents, and again, agree with them. You can choose not to wear your jacket. You can choose to walk outside even when it's cold, as you said in that oversimplified example, obviously, and freeze. The question is, could you choose to want to wear a jacket? Meaning, even if you define free will as the ability to do what you want to do or not do what you want to do, the question then underlying that is, can you choose what you want in the first place? And most people who are honest with themselves say, no, I can't choose what I want. And so it makes the point of whether or not you can act on your wants or not almost moot if you ultimately are a bundle of wants that either probabilistically get actualized or not.
got it. I think I understood. I'll be honest. I think I understood what you're saying, but I get what you're saying. So yeah, I think that those are all. I think that's a fair point. I think what I'll say to that as well is that I think the idea of free will is just one of those abstract things that is it feels very standalone in the sense that if you're a pragmatic person, completely pragmatic person who cuts out spirituality completely, then it's easier to lean on that as a crutch, as a way of living, to just accept that truth. Something you brought up earlier that you said a second ago is, you know, if you believe in God, then X, Y, and Z, and if you don't believe in God, then X, Y, Z, right? In that idea, and I know that's not what you exactly said here, but are you saying that you have to believe in God in order to believe in free will?
Yes and no, but which God and what does believe mean? And also, you'll be surprised that, for instance, Scientific American magazine, not so recently, but not all that long ago, did a survey of a self-selected group of readers of their peer-reviewed journal online. Over 4,000, almost 5,000 readers, if I remember correctly, and only 60% of them said that they do, in fact, believe in free will. Okay, that means that 40% do not, right? And in many surveys around the world, in many different institutions, you get fairly high numbers of people that don't believe they have any free will. And you have to remember that more than half of the world are, religious. They are spiritual. They believe in God. They claim to believe in God. Over, I think, almost 3 billion people are monotheistic. They claim to worship the same God that of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. So there are many, what I'm trying to say is there are many people, God-fearing people who actually say that they don't believe in any free will. And so that's the curious part for me, is to kind of unpack both sides. The materialist atheists, right, who classically don't believe in God. And you'll see, if you go on YouTube or any medium, you start asking, Googling, asking ChatGPT, what is the ultimate consensus from physicists and biologists and evolutionary biologists and neuroscientists on free will, you'll get overwhelmingly that the National Academy of Sciences, of which are 93%, atheists, self-proclaimed atheists, no free will. There's no discussion to be had. It's an illusion. If that, it's a moot talking point. So what I'm trying to say is even people who do subscribe to the idea of God don't necessarily believe in free will. And that's what makes it so slippery. And that's why, I teach classes. I don't do podcasts all that much. As you could probably see, I broke your 4-minute rule. I might have interrupted you even. I'm so rude. You're so respectful. I'm a bad Jew. Like I said, you're a good Jew. And so really what I want to say is that in the context of a class, I like to present things very, very thoroughly. You might need a part two when it comes to free will. I'm just being perfectly honest, And so when it comes to actually, sinking your teeth into this topic, I think it needs to be done with the utmost respect to those people that don't believe that we have any free will. Because that's darn depressing. And these are brave people that say, I don't care if it's inconvenient and you don't like it and it's not sexy or doesn't feel good that I'm telling you you're essentially a robot. If that's what the data shows, then that's what the data shows, right? So I respect that marriage to truth, right? On the other hand, I think they're dead wrong. I think that it's a very dangerous position to take, both for the justice system, if you really think about it, which is built on the premise that the person in the hot seat could have done otherwise, and therefore we are going to hold them responsible for what they did, right? The whole idea of feeling guilt, feeling shame is only a reasonable emotion to experience if you could have actually done otherwise. Even the flip side is true. The feeling of accomplishment and pride is only reasonable if you could have failed, if the whole world could have been another way, right? What are you proud of if it was a deterministic result of cause and effect since the beginning of time and space 13.78 billion years ago, right? And so it's a really big topic. It has massive implications, and I'm glad your listeners and you are so interested in it. And no, I cannot prove it. To answer your question in a very, very long-winded rabbinical way, I cannot prove it. I cannot demonstrate it, but I can give you some food for thought. And I can always ask my students and myself when I look in the mirror, the one question that really is the guiding principle for my life, which is, what's more reasonable? We can talk about possibility, and we can talk about probability. And what's more probable? What's more likely? And that's what should guide us.
Definitely. So let's sink our teeth into it then. And if you want to go with those that fork in the road of one or the other, let's talk about probability then. I'm just gonna choose an option out of the hat there. All I can say is that it's an in-depth topic, and we'll probably go over the 30 minutes. Already we're at 23 minutes of this interview, and I personally don't care. I want to hear the full concept. It's typically a 30-minute format, but this is an in-depth idea. I also want to talk about how this even connects to Torah, because we've mentioned a lot of different studies, and yeah, I get it. You're on a Jewish podcast, but what does it actually have to do with Judaism at the end of the day?
Yeah, good question. So let's state the obvious. Judaism, and I think many spiritual traditions, are based on the premise that you do have free will, that you are going to be held accountable in the next world, so to speak, as a disembodied soul, right, for what you did, what you said, and even what you thought. Okay, in many traditions, and even in this world, if one subscribes to the idea of a God that is actively involved in the world, right, that both transcends it and is imminently here right now, then even in this world there are consequences for spiritual acts, right? And so if there is a concept called in Hebrew schar va'onesh, of reward and punishment, right, then it must be that if God is in fact perfect and just and good, which are all in line with our monotheistic view of God and what was revealed to us and what we can intuit philosophically, then if we don't have free will, then some people are put into this world essentially to be punished, to have a negative outcome, consequence of all their spiritual decisions. And some people are put here to be rewarded, right? And to have positive consequences and outcomes. And so that just does not vibe if there's no free will. So obviously in Judaism, there is free will, right? It's one of the basic tenets of Judaism. That's the Torah for you, right? To quote the Talmud tells us, Hakol b'yedei shemayim, chutz miyirat shemayim, which means that everything is in the hands of heavens. Interestingly, that seems to go against the concept of free will. It literally means that everything is predetermined, except for one thing, which is your awe of the heavens, your spiritual level that you reach throughout your life of enlightenment and acting accordingly to your level of understanding of the reality of the spiritual world, right? So here you have this duality already starting to be presented in the words of our sages in the Talmud, which is that there's a highly deterministic level of reality, but yet there is room for free will. The Rambam, Maimonides, the greatest of the Jewish philosophers, at least the most known in the outside world, definitely makes this very, very explicit when he says that everything about your life is predetermined from before you were even conceived, right? And this kind of goes along with what you had said, which is I didn't choose to be born. And I'm going to add to that, I didn't choose where I was born and to whom I was born and what time period I was born and what my socioeconomic status is going to be when I'm born and what school I'm going to be put in and what silly clothing I'm going to be put in by my parents and what they're going to feed me and what they're going to put in front of me as a screen while they do whatever they need to do and kind of distract me from bothering them, and who my classmates are and who my potential friends are and who my teachers are and who my everything in your life, if you think about it, if you speak to the average psychologist, has already been quote unquote predetermined and highly impactful on who you end up being. We call this nurture, right? In the nature versus nurture debate, but also the nature is your genealogy, right? That's your nature, right? So your genetic code, right? And how it manifests itself biochemically, right? That's the nature. And that's going to determine so much about you. And the nurture is everything I just said. You're not in control of that. And the Rambam says, right, this is almost 1,000 years ago, that according to our sages, of course, you have no free will when it comes to these things, and they will essentially determine many things that you do, say, and think, except he leaves space for one area and one area alone in your life in which you do have free will, and that is, as he calls it, are you going to be a tzaddik or are you going to be a rasha? Are you going to be righteous and ultimately fulfill the purpose for which you were created? Or, God forbid, are you going to be quote unquote wicked, broken, right, and not complete that purpose ultimately for which you were created? And that is ultimately up to you, because that is, from a Jewish perspective, the purpose of having been created in the first place, to win the game, right, to succeed, right, to be a partner with God in creation. And so that's the Torah, outlook on free will, which is yes and no, right? Now, what I'm more interested in than just simply what it says in the sources is, how do you have a sophisticated conversation with someone who doesn't believe that we can even possibly choose anything in our life?
Before we get
At all.
there,
Yeah.
before we get,
Go for
so
it.
everything you said is amazing. I think it's super fascinating. But the one thing I wanna understand more so is, like, again, going back to the idea of, if you're an atheist, is it then even possible to believe in free will logically?
Yeah, so let's break it down. I mean, the argument from determinists, materialists, those who believe that, all, as Floyd put it, right, all you touch and all you see is all your life will ever be, right? Great song. Unfortunately, another anti-Semite, not so closet about it nowadays, Roger Waters, right? But great song. Is it true that which we perceive with our five senses and with our very fancy instrumentation over the last 100 years, right, is that all that truly exists, right? Is time and space, right? Is the material world the end all be all of reality? So if a person is a materialist and they believe yes, because, science, then they're stuck, because the physical world, let's put it this way, right? I mean, Einstein, okay? Einstein was asked in 1931 about free will, and his response was that our human sense of free will, right, is the same as the moon's belief, supposing he was a conscious thinking being, right, that it freely is moving about the earth on its own will. And we know that what he was implying, Einstein, a great Jew, right, ultimately an ignorant Jew in terms of his own spiritual tradition, unfortunately, but no one can blame him for that in the time period that he was raised in, by the family that he was raised in, the culture and everything like that. But ultimately, he's comparing a human being to the moon, which is a celestial body that functions primarily, I mean, exclusively, you might say, right, in terms of Newtonian physics, by the laws of physics, right? That's it, right? And the moon doesn't have a will of its own, right? The moon behaves in patterns that are aligned with and consistent with the properties of the matter of which the moon is made, and all of the different, many laws of strong and weak forces and nuclear forces and gravitational forces and electromagnetic forces that govern, to name just a few of them, the universe. So to say that the moon, if it did have a mind, could act on its own, thinking that it's circling the earth on its own, is ridiculous. That's a purely celestial, physics perspective. And if everything from the beginning of time and space that we know of right now, which is about 300,000 years after this Big Bang, right, then there's no chance that we have any free will, because everything, like you said originally at the beginning of this episode, is cause and effect. And since I'm not responsible for the previous cause, how in the world can I choose what the effect will be, right? And that's from a physicalist perspective. A neuroscientist will also tell you the same thing. You have a bunch of inputs. I mentioned some of them earlier on this episode, right? All of those things that make you tick, your nature and your nurture. Those are your inputs. Everything you've seen, experienced, smelled, tasted, touched, right, heard in your life is an input. If we had an algorithm, right, that we knew was running through your brain, which our brains are like supercomputers, right, in terms of the neural networks. You have a supercomputer inside of that cranium of yours, right? It's running an algorithm. You take all the inputs, you put them onto a spreadsheet, right? Theoretically, if I knew all of your inputs, right? Everything you've ever seen, heard, touched, smelled, tasted, thought in your life, right? And then I put it through an algorithm, which is the decision point. I can do something now. I can interrupt the rabbi who's going on and on and on, or I cannot, right? I have all these, I'm kind of hungry, should I have eaten before this episode? Should I? All of these thoughts and choices that we ultimately have in our life, right? That's a decision point. An algorithm with certain inputs will spit out a certain output. The algorithm isn't, quote unquote, choosing the output. The output has been chosen by the inputs. And you and I agree that we're not responsible for the inputs. So therefore, right, the functionality, right, is going to make us into a deterministic robot, right? We're just a meat marionette, as I call it, right? You are nothing more than a meat marionette. Sounds better than puppet, you know what I'm saying? It also, the MM thing, But the point is like, yeah, I mean, you look at Sam Harris. Oh, I wish I had a good quote from Sam Harris. Oh, I do. Do I? Yeah, here we go. How can we be free as conscious agents if everything that we consciously intend is caused by events in our brain that we don't intend and of which we are entirely unaware? Sam Harris is taking the step even further. He's a great Jew, who unfortunately also, while standing up for Israel, right, and our ability and our right to defend ourselves and to exist as a sovereign Jewish state, is, again, by no fault of his own, oblivious to his spiritual tradition. And he calls consciousness a miracle. But at the same time, he does. But at the same time, he says that we're neural network machines, right? And most experiments show that as long as 7 seconds before we're even conscious of the decision that we're going to make, a scientist can already predict that based on the signals of our brain as we can measure them in a lab. So Sam Harris believes that we have absolutely no free will. He's a neuroscientist. I think most neuroscientists don't believe that we have any free will whatsoever, and they're going based off their research. So from a neuroscience perspective, inputs through an algorithm equals a certain output, right? You're no different than a computer, right? And from a physics perspective, you're no different than the moon. You're no different than any bit of stardust out there in the world, which doesn't have consciousness in the first place, by the way, mind you, and acts totally based on laws that are outside of its own control. So how can we have free will? I totally understand why the average atheist believes that we don't have any free will, right?
Right. It's fascinating.
What's shocking is that religious people don't believe that we have free will, as we had said. And I want to also offer their perspective on why they believe that we don't have any free will.
I was going to say as well that I think you made that point very interesting, very, very clearly about atheists in a very interesting way, in a very articulate way, shifting over to people who do believe in God. So then you have the school of thought of, well, God is this benevolent being. He brought you into this world. Again, you didn't ask for it, but he brought you into this world. And we are often taught, especially in the world of Judaism, that everything exists because of God. Everything is God, right? Including a piece of you. So at the end of the day, if everything is a part of that, and you're just existing in God's world and you just happen to be living in it, and everything is to his will, then how could you possibly exist in a world of free will then?
Exactly. Judaism is both, interestingly, panentheistic and panpsychist. Okay. I'll define those terms in a second. Okay.
Yeah.
So panentheism is the understanding that God not only transcends this universe of time and space in which we find ourselves, this finite, bubble, so to speak, of an expanding yet finite universe, but he also supersedes it. He interpenetrates it. He is immanently present within it, right? So panentheism means that God is, as you said, so to speak, the universe and then some. He also transcends it, which is a key differentiating factor between panentheism, pan, all, and in theism, God. All is within God, implying that God exists beyond the universe, and pantheism, which is totally not Jewish, which is the idea of Baruch Spinoza, another Jew who unfortunately diverged from his traditional education. That's an interesting character to look into just for your audience. Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, a great philosopher, but again, one who misunderstood or I'm going to judge favorably misunderstood and not say that he perverted our Judaism. But the point is, he was a pantheist. And funny enough, so was Einstein. He espoused the Spinozan God, as he called it, which is that the universe and God are synonymous, that the universe is God. And you kind of said that also. It slips off the tongue so nicely that everything is God. And that is absolutely not true from a Jewish perspective. Everything is not God, so to speak, right? Meaning everything, meaning me, you, this computer that I'm looking at, this glass that I'm holding in my hand, this is not God, right? This is finite. This has certain properties and is very limited, right? God is the infinite. The Ein Sof is the infinite, meaning non-bounded, unlimited, undefined, undefinable, immeasurable, ultimately oneness, which also, if he's oneness, as we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that we know that Hear, O Israel, God, our God, the Lord is one, right? Which is maybe the one line that so much of your viewership definitely is and should be familiar with. Although I've helped Israelis, believe it or not, who know Hebrew fluently, say the Shema for the first time in their life, in their 20s and 30s at the Western Wall. So never underestimate the level of ignorance, unfortunately, by no fault of their own, that I myself shared until I was 22. But the point is that when we say that God is one, well, what are we saying? We're not saying that there is one God. We're saying God is undifferentiated oneness. That means that God has no parts, undifferentiated oneness, which you can't picture. You close your eyes, you're seeing black. Black is something, right? Black is not nothing. Black is not everything. When I say all-encompassing oneness, it's something that's beyond our finite mind's capability of understanding, but it also means that God has no parts. And therefore, you're not a part of God. I'm not a part of God. That's an expression. Everything is God. You're a part of God. Your soul's a part of God. That are used colloquially because of our limited minds, but is not actually accurate theologically and actually poses a lot of issues theologically. What I do want to say, though, is that back to our topic directly, even though I think all of that was indirectly connected, and that is that someone who understands that panentheism, we exist entirely within God, but God transcends it and is present right now. And that we also understand God to be this panpsychist entity. Panpsychism is the idea that there is something beyond just the physical here and now, but panpsychism means that psyche, which is consciousness, is pan, is universal, is everywhere, meaning that we ultimately exist inside of a universal consciousness that we relate to as God. And through the Torah's revelation, we relate to as the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey and the Tetragrammaton as God, so to speak. If you actually subscribe to the revelation, the Sinai revelation, the way that we do is that God introduced himself from that infinite realm into the finite realm that he created. But ultimately, he actually is ever presently conscious, that consciousness is fundamental to reality, not just time and space, and that we exist as the thoughts of this living consciousness called God, that this world is nothing more than a very complex, but very dependent and, super fragile thought hologram in the mind of God, essentially. Okay. And so from that perspective, just like in your own mind, when you conjure up in an imaginative scenario, a person, a city, an event, something, when you are imagining it and you put that time and effort into conjuring it entirely, where you can taste it and you can feel it and you can see it and you can hear it and you can smell it, right? It has no free will. It's entirely dependent upon you at every single moment for its very existence and every single property of it as well. And so if we view this universe as Jews, as entirely dependent upon this infinite consciousness willing us into existence, then like you said, how in the world can I possibly go against that infinite consciousness? How can I, if a character in my own mind, if my mind is healthy and not dealing with mental illness, which we don't believe God to be dealing with, right? Because that's an imperfection and a lacking, which is an anathema to what God's perfection and oneness and infinite nature, then if I can't even be rebelled against by a figment of my own imagination, because I'm in control of every single thought it has, right? Every capability of it, then how can we as human beings, so to speak, go against the will of God? The joke is that if you look at the Torah, the vast majority of all of humanity, mostly unknowingly, but some knowingly, are, so to speak, and we all make this mistake. That's why Elul and Rosh Hashanah is coming up. We go against the will of God. How could we go against the will of God if God is literally willing us into existence right now? That means that when I'm doing something that quote unquote God said, please don't do, and sometimes he actually does say please in the Torah, God is actually willing me into existence while I'm doing that. So the question is, how can we possibly have free will in a world where we are nothing more than the manifestation of the infinite will of God? And so from a atheist perspective and from a theist perspective, we reached a really difficult place where we have to understand just how is it possible that we have free will, which I believe it is. And I believe that is ultimately true.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the way that you've pieced that together is essentially that, okay, we're existing because we're a figment of Hashem's imagination, as you said. We're a hologram, so to speak, right? Cool idea. That's amazing. But then if that's the case, then why doesn't God just have us do exactly everything he wants us to do in the Torah? Like,
Right.
technically speaking, if that was the case, then the entire society that we live in today would function so much smoother and life would just be so much better.
Yeah, that might be true, but we wouldn't even be present to experience it if that was the case. What do I mean by that is as follows, is that if we were to be deterministically doing, so to speak, the will of God, then there would be no us to speak of. What I mean by that is that if it's true that every single thought I have, word I say, and action that I take is actually fully at the behest of this infinite consciousness, then that's not me. I'm nothing more than a glove, so to speak, on God's hand, right? And for God to have created a universe where everything is entirely in his control, including the behavior of human beings who are the apex of creation, right? I mean, we evolved last according to the theory of evolution and according to the Torah's narrative. We come as the crowning jewel on creation. Everything was created in this universe. The stage was set perfectly for us human beings to then be the primary actors on that stage. But there's a lot of improv going on. If it was entirely scripted, if we were scripted actors on this stage of the world, then God essentially would be bored. And this thought hologram in God's quote unquote Godhead, which is not a physical place, I just want to make it clear for your listeners, we're talking totally in metaphor here. God would be providing himself with rich entertainment, which God does not need. Human beings need Netflix and video games because we get bored or we want to be distracted from what we actually should be doing at any given moment, our relationships, our jobs, right? And whatever else we have going on in our life. But God has no desire to be distracted. He has no lackings. He has no boredom. And therefore, he has no interest and no need, so to speak, for a scripted performance. What he is interested in is giving of himself, is sharing the gift of existence. And in order to exist, and this is the key, you must be God-like. In order for us to actually have any independent semblance of existence, we must be, quote unquote, made in the image of God. And God ultimately, at his core, is independent. God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And so what the Torah means when the Torah says that you as human beings, by the way, this is true for Jews and non-Jews, 100%. This is not a insular cabal. Judaism is actually the world's religion. We're the religion of love, right? And this is a universal language that I'm speaking right now, hopefully, I think, to all of your listeners, right? Because at this point in our exile, by the way, you should just know that every one of us, even in our own immediate family, have non-Jews in our family who are precious and beloved to us and to God, right? And the Torah is speaking to everybody all at once. And so what's important to understand is that being made in the image of God, which the Torah says about every single human being, one interpretation of that is that just like God is independent and can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, despite all of the inputs, despite all of the factors pushing God to quote unquote do one thing, he can choose at any given moment to do whatever he wants. So too human beings have that potentiality. We have that ability potentially to actually exercise our own independence and do what we want, even when it goes against God's prescribed will, because there's a higher level will. Lower level will, like you said, Chaz, everyone just do what I say, when I say it, how I say it, and trust me, it'll be good for you. As we see ourselves when we practice the Torah, we see life is amazing. It's meaningful, it's rich. The routine, all of the insights, they give us value and meaning like we could never imagine before a life of Torah observance. However, that's only the lower level of God's will. The higher level of God's will is that you choose that there's actually a you that chooses that. And so that's what it means to have a soul. And if we don't have a soul, if we quote unquote are just a meat marionette, we're just a meat puppet, we're just a bunch of, as Francis Crick put it, look at Francis Crick was the discoverer, one of the two discoverers of the double helix of DNA. And he said, you your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Meaning, he said, there is no such thing as you. It's an illusion. You're just a complex machine that's imagining itself existing in some individualistic way, right? And if you have a soul, then you are not your brain. You have a brain. You're tethered to a brain. But your consciousness, is not the product of the physical structure called your nerve cells and your associated molecules. You're more than that. You're tethered to it. Same way that the internet is tethered to your laptop, but it's not inside of the laptop. The internet's on your computer is not broken, when the Wi-Fi goes out. It's just that you have a lot of complex machinery, hardware and software, right? And something is wrong, but the internet's just fine, Grandma. You know what I'm saying? The internet on your phone the internet is okay, Grandma, even if Grandma's phone dies,
Right.
even if Grandma's phone breaks, the internet's just fine.
Right.
And the most important files, by the way, are backed up on the cloud. So too, you are a very complex piece of machinery, a lot of hardware, DNA, right? And whatnot, a lot of software, right? Your processing abilities and this and that. But at the end of the day, your soul, which is not who you are, gives you the ability to act independently in the image of God and actually will a different reality into the mix. Despite all of the inputs, your free will gives you the ability to choose an output. And that's only something that could be possible with a soul and with, like I said, the Torah, our ancient tradition, being true, because it's the Torah as revelation that tells us that you are made in the image of God. And that God actually says in the Torah, I place in front of you life and death, blessing and curse, good and evil. Choose goodness, choose blessing, choose life, right? And that was not a political statement. Choose life means choose living in reality.
Got it.
Instead of the virtual, instead of choosing the virtual reality, which is essentially death, which is plugging out of the timeless world into a very constrained world. That was a mouthful, as always.
Yeah, no, it's a refreshing amount of knowledge, and I really appreciate it. Here's something I want to ask you, though, because I always like to end the podcast on practical things that people can do to kind of act on these different ideas. You mentioned acting godlike and higher levels of decrees versus lower levels of decrees, right? What is a higher level practical step that listeners can do to behave more godlike and truly embrace free will?
Great question. So step one is realizing that you are not a body, but you have a body, and that you are a soul. And a person that walks around realizing that everything that I do in this world, everything that I say, everything that I think is a way of relating to myself. I can relate to myself as a body or a soul. I can relate to other people as bodies or souls. And I can relate to the source of all souls, right, as a real personal consciousness, or as just the mask of the natural world of time and space that he's clothed himself in, so to speak. And so one practical step, and this is really what all of Judaism is one giant mindfulness tool, is to be mindful of the fact that you are a soul. And so when I'm speaking, am I speaking as a animalistic primitive ego? Am I almost worshiping my worries by thinking about things and speaking about things that I have no control over? Am I attacking people for the immediate threats, whether it's to my comfort or to my job or to my, romance or whatever it is? Or am I looking at people as holistic spiritual entities that are really having, this is a higher level of practical thinking, which is that you, Chaz, we spoke about parts. So God might not have any parts, but it's very clear from the Torah that when God created the world, he created one master soul and he put it into Adam. And that split into two, Adam and Eve. They were one. Adam and Chava were one. Two parts of one whole, two halves of one whole. And then it splintered. And all of humanity now that has a soul, right, is actually part of one common descendant. Not necessarily evolutionarily speaking, I'm not going to get into that whole topic, but definitely spiritually speaking, I believe that the coming year, 5,785, is not a celebration of 5,785 years of time and space and the Big Bang. That would be going against it. An overwhelming body of empirical evidence that I choose not to do personally. And I still think that it aligns with my Orthodox belief system. But it is the anniversary of the introduction of the soul into humanity. And there was a marked change in civilization approximately 6,000 years ago that your listenership can study for themselves. And so you and I are part of the same whole, are the part of the same master soul. Hurting you is hurting me. We're part of the same level of reality, the same level of being, right? And so practically speaking for ourselves, relate to yourself as a soul, not as a body. So the act of eating, right? That's something that I need to do in order to keep my soul tethered to my body. It's not a hobby. It's not a lifestyle. Eating, I know I'm going to offend a lot of foodies out there, and trust me, my wife is a great cook, and I should stay out of the kitchen. By the look on my kids' faces when I make something, and taking my wife's advice. But what I'm trying to say is that eating is something that you do, right, in order to survive. It's not a lifestyle. Sex is not something that we do for entertainment. It's something that we do in order to connect to one another in the highest way with the right person at the right time in the right way, right? And so all these things that people are struggling with, their sexual desires, their food desires, right? When it comes to just lots of bad habits, right? You think about yourself as a soul and ask yourself the question, am I acting like a soul right now? What is a soul interested in? A soul is interested in building. A soul is interested in knowledge. A soul is interested in growing, self-actualizing. That's what a soul is interested in. It's not interested in the here and now, right? It's interested in using the here and now for a higher goal, right? And that's in personal relationships, in relationships with other people. It's the level of respect. And in the relationship with God, it's the acknowledgement that life is a free gift. There is nothing that you did to deserve to be here right now, breathing and living and experiencing. And some level of existence is better than no level of existence. And ask the people that jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, they'll all tell you, the survivors, that at the very last moment, or actually even as soon as they jump, they all say, I wish I didn't do this. I want to exist. Existence, even in my sorry state right now that I'm going through this challenge in my life, is better than what I'm in for right now. I don't want to not exist. All of us want to exist. And so when you think about the source of all souls, when you think about this universal consciousness, this infinite God, be grateful. Express your gratitude. That's the ultimate way of being a soul, is acknowledging that nothing is a given. I'm not a collection of random molecules and nerve cells. I'm not just the ultimate effect of a cause that started billions of years ago. If God is an infinite consciousness and he's willing this world into existence at every single moment, then however many people there are in this world, let's say 8 billion, then infinity divided by 8 billion is still infinity, which means God is paying an infinite amount of attention to every single one of us at every single moment. And that alone can give you a sense of pride, give you a sense of meaning and love and being loved that every single person needs in order to wake up in the morning and have the most meaningful, powerful day.
Rabbi Dubov, incredible insights, incredible ideas. And I think that you've given the audience quite a lot to chew on. And I'm really, really grateful for the high level of intellect, the high level of teaching that you provided to this episode. I think it's such a great concept. I knew going into this episode that free will was not something you could just squeeze into a 30-minute episode. I'm glad it extended over because we really got more into the depths of what it means to have free will. I'm sure there's even more that can be expanded on. And maybe that's worth having another 1 hour part 2 episode on there. But I want to thank you, Rabbi Dubov, for being here and providing so much time, being generous with your time to teach this concept to my followers. For the listeners out there, what is the best way to engage with you personally?
Great question. So with me personally, a great way to engage is here in Jerusalem at the Aish World Center. If you're so privileged to actually come to this beautiful land of Israel, I teach seminars and classes almost on a daily basis here at Aish. We're starting a new set of classes online at Aish Plus. So I know that I see in the banner, thankyouplus.aish.com. So I'm going to be available there from time to time. You can grill me. There's Q&As, there's classes. And then for the men, there's Olami Together. You can sign up for a one-on-one. And for the women, there's something called Sold, which ultimately, for many of them, leads to a trip here, a highly sponsored trip to Israel, where I'm also an educator on the Women's Aish program as well. So thank you, Chaz, for giving me this platform to just have this conversation with you, hopefully to clarify some misconceptions, to open people's minds up to new ideas. And I hope I was respectful to all viewpoints, but ultimately, as Jews, we have this incredible tribal tradition that goes back at least 3,337 years of this past Shavuot. And I think it's so important that we engage with it in a sophisticated and meaningful way.
Fantastic. Rabbi Dubov, So beautifully said. I really hope the listeners do get to engage with you and have the privilege of engaging with you through the different routes that you provided. And to the listeners, thank you so much for bearing with the extent of this episode and for tuning in. I really hope you found it as interesting as I did. We'll see you next Wednesday on the next episode of Bad Jew.
Shalom.